Mr. Hostetter was born on August 2nd, 1926. He was the youngest of 8 siblings, 5 boys and 3 girls. They all lived on a farm with their parents. Until Mr. Hostetter enlisted, their farm was where he lived for 18 years.
Although Mr. Hostetter's parents disagreed, he decided that enlisting was the right thing to do. When Mr. Hostetter was in high school in 1944, he decided to enlist into the Air Cadets. One of the reasons he wanted to enlist in the Air Corps was because of his interest in the country. Another was because he thought it would give him a better opportunity to be a pilot, and it would be easier for him to get an occupation after serving.
Soon after Mr. Hostetter enlisted, he was inducted into Harrisburg and sent to Keeser Field in Mississippi for the start of his basic training and eventually advanced training. For his basic training, Mr. Hostetter had to pass 64 physicals, which in his words were strenuous but very doable. Mr. Hostetter didn't pass one of his physicals because of a hernia, but still moved on to his advanced training. Mr. Hostetter said there wasn't much advanced training. In his words, it was.
We didn't go through much of advanced training, just flying and trying to get familiarized with the planes and the different aspects of the instruments and things that were in the plane, so that we could do the controlling if necessary as a co-pilot.
At the same time as he was going through strenuous physical conditions during training, he had some bad environmental conditions to endure as well. He said,
Rough situation where we were training. We had to be out in tents, and it was in the swamp grounds, and there was snakes and all kind of different reptiles that were out there that we had to deal with. I know one night, during the night, there was a snake came in and crawled over me in a tent where I was sleeping, and so.
In Mr. Hostetter's battalion for basic training, the groups of men stayed together. There was a total of 100 men in the groups.
Once Mr. Hostetter completed his training, he was ready to begin his work in the Air Corps as an air cadet. Throughout the day, Penrose had to complete tasks like inspecting airplanes and co-piloting planes. When Mr. Hostetter inspected the planes, he had to go through a checklist which had things like checking the propellers and making sure there was no damage during the previous flight. One of the planes he inspected was a C-47. When Mr. Hostetter had to co-pilot planes, he mostly flew a C-45. The purpose of these flights was to transport troops or supplies. Mr. Hostetter mainly flew in Puerto Rico. However, he had to take a boat to get to Puerto Rico and had to oversee a mission on transporting women. From there, he flew a lot of planes in Puerto Rico, and although he had a lot of missions in Puerto Rico, he was not limited to it. He had missions elsewhere as well.
The purpose of the trip to Puerto Rico was to transport Women's Army Auxiliary Corps from Puerto Rico to Louisiana. The ship was filled with over 200 Puerto Ricans and 25 of people who had the same responsibility like Mr. Hostetter. Mr. Penrose Hostetter's occupation on that ship was to be a guard and protect the people. Also, he was to oversee everything that it was running smoothly. Things he watched over were big places everyone was, like the eating area. Mr. Hostetter said that they were overseen to take account for the people on the ship. The food served daily on the ship was a good amount of eggs and other foods that were grown locally and that were brought in as canned. The food they had available were rationed a lot.
Some locations Mr. Hostetter visited was different islands around Puerto Rico, such like St. Thomas. He specifically remembers flying in a dangerous takeoff towards the mountains and catching water with propellers. Supplies Mr. Penrose Hostetter delivered to different locations was alcohol and other things they picked up in some of these islands. Other supplies needed were for the men that provide supplies for their equipment they needed for everyday's work. The tasks accomplished were enjoyed by Air Cadet Penrose Hostetter.
Yeah, I felt that it was a good experience for me, that I could get out and see what was going on into the world, and also for the Army, it kind of in the Air Cadets. I was glad that I was in the Air Cadets, because some of them that were drafted were taken and put into the infantry, and so we were enlisted. I enlisted, and so I was protected.
Mr. Hostetter was asked if he had any time off, such as R&R. He responded that yes, he was given free time. An experience he remembered was with a friend called Shorty. Shorty had license to fly small airplanes, and in Puerto Rico, they used their free time to fly around. Mr. Hostetter's experience with tragic or gruesome scenes were minimum. They were well protected in Puerto Rico, serving as an air cadet. Ways Mr. Hostetter communicated was with mail. They were letters they could and received mails from family and friends.
Mr. Hostetter recalls having made acquaintances while serving, but has not kept in touch for a while. He flew more planes with his friend Shorty for a little while after they returned home. Mr. Hostetter says that it was a good thing and kind of a shock to come back to the area where he was raised for 18 years.
Mr. Hostetter's uniform was the color of brown. It had a hat with a lip on the front. It was designed to keep you warm, and also it was efficient material to keep it long-lasting. The shoes were sturdy enough to walk in. The uniform were basically like any other regular uniform. The uniforms were washed for the men, and they had multiple sets of uniforms as well.
Mr. Hostetter received a pair of Air Cadet wings. They represented the Air Force and flying of the Air Force. It displayed that you were one of the personnel that was in World War II. He earned them by being accepted into the Air Cadets.
We thank Mr. Penrose Hostetter for his service during World War II and the time he took to tell us about his experience. The time and energy he took to serve for our country is very much appreciated.